we are back on the 0 Hour. Once again, I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. And joining us once again is our good friend, Professor Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff is the host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV. He is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. He is a visiting professor at New York University. He is the author of several books, the latest of which is The Sickness is the System. And I always look forward to our conversations. So without any further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you very much, RJ. Glad to be here.
So here's what I've been thinking about lately. When I was maybe 10, Ralph Nader became very famous for writing a book called Unsafe at Any Speed. And while I'm not sure I was precocious enough to read the book, I might have, but I understood what it was about. My parents told me about it. It was in all the news. And one of the concepts that stunned me at the time as a child, and kids are intelligent, right? So one of the things that struck me was that General Motors had gone through a calculation that said, if they upgraded every Corvair so that it wouldn't explode in a rear-end collision, it would cost them, I'm making up numbers now, $10 million. Whereas if they get sued for $200,000 every time someone burns to death in a Corvair, might only cost them $2 or $3 million. So they made the clinically, from a sociopathic point of view, logical decision to spend less money and burn a few people to death every year. I never lost my horror and fascination with that, even though as I grew older and learned about economics, all of a sudden it didn't seem so strange in our world, which is a sign of, what we go through being indoctrinated. But, and I was also thinking about the expression, well-intentioned expression. Nobody ever says, on their deathbed, I wish I'd spent more time at the office. The nice thing to say, but it's also like, aren't you comparing two things of an utterly different status? One is not concrete, one is human and intangible and alive and, vibrant with emotion. The other is static. And that gets me around to the Marxist concept. You don't have to be a Marxist, our listeners. I will remind you to know that there are things you will find of value in the history of that thought, of reification, which, I would simplify as Thingification, right? You're taking something that is not a thing and thingifying. You're treating it like a thing. But we'll talk about that more. You'll correct me where I'm wrong. And I was thinking about the fact that if you want to understand this phenomenon, and I will tell you, and you are very learned in this area, that it is very hard for even the typical politically active, aware, intelligent person to grasp a concept like reification, because if you look it up on Google, you get things about how the dialectic affects it. You have to learn an entire subculture's language, even if you Google simple definition of reification, right? But I think the concept is vitally important. And I wanted to talk with you about it today, particularly as we face the multiple crises we're facing today. So I guess I would ask you first, in your own words, I know the idea has undergone some evolution since Marx's time, but what is reification to you? Help us understand it.
Okay, I think the best way to get into this is to say that there are at least two different ideas or meanings wrapped up in this term. There are probably more than these two, but these are two that are major ones. The first one, in a sense, you've already explained. When you take objects that we can think about, a tree, an animal, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, when you take these kinds of objects and you turn them into static, unchanging things. That's where the word thingification, because the reification comes from the old Latin root re or race, and that stands for the word thing. Usually an inanimate object, usually, even if it's animate, it's static, it's somehow fixed. And that leads us into the second kind of definition, in which reification means you take something changing all the time and you freeze it. You treat it not as something in change, but something fixed, static, unmoving, untransforming. And, this goes back probably most sharply to the German philosopher Hegel, who insisted in his thinking that every possible object of human thought is changing all the time, that the only form of the existence of anything is that it is going to be different in the next instant from what it was now. It was a very difficult concept to get across to people for whom the notion that everything is constantly changing makes them almost dizzy. It makes them people feel, if they're raised in a different way, that everything is falling apart, that everything is up for grabs. You can see across the political spectrum from left to right, and often confusing these differences between left and right, people who need to have something fixed to hold on to, even though somewhere they know what Hegel taught us, which there is no thing that doesn't change. And let me give you some examples, may make it easier. You're known as RJ. Last year, yes, last year you were known as RJ. 20 years ago, you were known as RJ. What are we doing here? You're not the same person. You couldn't be. A million different experiences differentiate you today from what you were a year ago, 10 years ago, when you were a child, and so on. But we're nervous about that. And so we have developed as a human race a convention. We're going to fix you as RJ, and the government is going to deal with you as a constant, but you're not. You are, in fact, changing all the time. And the people around you who interact with you are going to make big mistakes in dealing with you because they don't ask the question, how has this person that I knew last year, that I grew up with, that I lived next door with, that I worked with, how has he changed? And they can be upset by the change, as if somehow this is disordering the universe. And there we get to Hegel again, who would say, a very famous phrase of his, you can never step in the same river twice, because neither you nor the river is now what it was when last you, quote unquote, stepped into it. Let me give you a very stark example. I believe the evidence is now overwhelming that the American empire that existed for most of the last century is over, that we are in a period of economic and empire decline, that the core position of the United States as the dominant economic power, gathering around it the allies we now call the G7, that is Western Europe, Canada, Japan, allies of the United States. Their dominant position was, in fact, always changing, always subject to countless influences that shifted it. Over the last 20 years, those influences not only diminished the economic and political footprint of the United States, but likewise, and in a related way, rose up or raised the economic footprint of another powerful alliance, China and its allies, known as the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So that, for example, right now, the dominant economic bloc is the BRICS. They account for about 23% of the total output of goods and services in the United States, on this planet. Whereas the G7, the United States and its allies, account for about 29% of the world's output. That is an enormous transformation. A new empire may be arising, or maybe a new multinational kind of configuration. But the age of the American empire is now shrinking, is declining. Now, that has happened to every other empire the world has known. The Roman, the Greek, the Persian, the Turkish, doesn't matter. And therefore, there's nothing, quote unquote, surprising. And if you're not reified in your thinking, you would have known that the United States' global position was always changing, and that there was no way to be sure 1 year to the next, 1 decade to the next, what that change would be, how it would play out, what pace it would have, and so on. But our leaders, I would argue, and particularly the neocons that run our foreign policy, are living in a world of reification. They are acting as if what was, when they were 30 or 40 years ago, which was a dominant position, is somehow fixed, is somehow there. And so they don't understand what's going on. They have reified, they have frozen a process that is always changing, and they're making colossal mistakes. And I give you again an example. They thought that if they cut off the economic lifeline to Russia, it would bring the ruble into rubble, and it would bring Russia to its knees, and it didn't do any of those things. None of them. The ruble is worth as much or more today than it was before the invasion. And the Russians found it easy to switch from selling oil and gas to Europe to selling oil and gas to India and China. And had they understood the changing configuration, they would at least have understood that that might happen, and not gone in there with statements from the president on down that Russia would be on its knees, that this was the greatest sanctioned war and would win, and Ukraine will victory. None of it is happening. None of it has ever looked like it was happening, even from the very beginning. And yet they hold on. Last point, I don't want to talk too long. The greatest user of this concept of reification, other than Hegel, who in a sense developed it, was a Marxist, a Hungarian Marxist named Georg Lukács. And he wrote, back in the 1920s, he wrote a book called Reification and, forget the rest of it, and the history of world's class struggle or something like that. It was wonderful. He took as one of his examples the concept common sense. People like to think as though there's something innate in us as human beings that gives us the ability to tap into common sense. And he showed how variable common sense, how people's sense of what's common sense has always changed. But the need for people to say, no, it doesn't change. There's something that's rock hard, solid, fixed, is so desperate that it becomes a tool in the class struggle. If the people who run the society, a minority, the capitalists, need to keep the society working to their benefit, what they need to do is to shape what people think is common sense. If they can shape it in a certain way, that common sense will include the idea that you can't go beyond capitalism, that we will always be employers and employees. And he had fun. And once he opened it up, he said, in the times of slavery, long gone, everybody thought that the human race was divided into the master type person and the slave type person. That was common sense at the time. And then he had fun showing how we don't believe that anymore. And therefore, what we believe now to be common sense is as fleeting and changing as anything else. It kind of opens you up, this concept of reification, because now you can ask, if you couldn't before, how everything you thought was fixed isn't. And you then ask the question, whoa, where is it going? How is it getting there? What will it mean if these things change? And that's a very different way of looking at the world and existing in the world, as opposed to the one that thinks we are surrounded by fixed things, and therefore is constantly amazed, surprised, and upset when what they should have understood would be inevitable, namely change, impacts them.
A couple thoughts. One, Richard Wolff is, I couldn't help but think of William Blake's phrase, mind-forged manacles, to describe, the state of awareness you're talking about, the reified state of awareness, this viewing dynamic things as static, dynamic states as somehow static things. And in fact, you could even steal Blake's line for the boycotts. I think it was in every voice, in every band, the Mindforged manacles I hear. Dirk Lukács, I think his book was The Consciousness of the Proletariat,
That's
reification,
right.
And the Consciousness of the Proletariat.
Right.
Which is interesting because first of all, Richard Wolff, were as the son of a friend of mine was saying the other day, we're going deep. He and I were talking late one night the other night and about everything, existence, and his mother came in and said, let Richard rest. And he said, but Mom, we're going deep. She said, don't go deep. Don't go so deep. It's too late to go deep. But no, I said, no, I'm enjoying going deep. But, and I think this is important because I think that we're really tapping into a kind of state of awareness that people have been struggling with for a long time. I mean, to a certain extent, I think, Buddhism, some branches of Buddhism tried to look at it, but I think the human tendency is we want to make the map the world, right? And not see the world in this fluid state. But if that's the case, how do we navigate, right? How do we apply this awareness to when we open the newspaper in the morning, for example, and we read, as you and I record this, let's say, just picking some random headlines, the Supreme Court is expected to give its decision on student debt cancellation or delay or whatever it is, partial student debt cancellation. A billionaire is trapped underwater in a submarine with millions being spent in an attempt to rescue them. Hundreds of people, refugees, were capsized. Many died. I do not believe millions were spent ensuring their safety, and so on. But as we go through the news, what is this concept of don't thingify, don't reify do for us? How do we, the Buddhists wind up, some of them going into a mountaintop, a metaphorical mountaintop, but we want to be engaged in the world. So how does this help us?
Well, I think the most dramatic way I can articulate it is, how do you understand capitalism? How do you understand an economic system that positions a tiny minority at the top of a pyramid, the people who own and operate enterprises, factories, offices, stores, right? If you do a study the demography of the United States, the number of people that own and operate an enterprise depending on how you count, is between 1 and 3% of the population. The rest of us are employees, not employers. Okay, we allow a tiny minority sitting at the top to gather into its own hands the bulk of the wealth and the bulk of the power. Okay, now let's imagine if everything is changing, then it becomes logical for everybody to ask, gee, how was the organization of producing goods and services different in the past? And the corollary question, where is it going now? You would never assume it's going to stay this way. But I would argue to you that the bulk of the people living in capitalism today do not ask those questions. They simply assume, as in common sense, that it always was as it is now, and it always will be. And therefore, they don't ask the logical question which I want them to ask, and when I engage them in conversation or in any other way, I want them to get excited like I do that we can do better than capitalism. We can organize the production and distribution of goods and services in a way that makes us happier, better, have better relationships amongst us. And I point to the people in slavery who made that decision and got rid of it, and the people in feudalism who made that decision about their economic system and got rid of it. So that if we were able to understand change, we could also begin to discuss what we would like the change to look like. We could begin to have a rational influence on where the change ends up because we are conscious of the change that's available. It also alleviates depression. A lot of people are depressed because the system seems not to change. Wrong. You don't need to be depressed because your premise, the lack of change, is a mistake, is a very partisan way of looking at the world, which is in the service of the status quo. It's in the service of not change. That's what Lukács was trying to teach us. If you don't understand that everything is a change, you don't see the possibilities. And you think you're frozen in a frozen world. It's very hard for me, for example, as a teacher, to let people begin to understand that capitalism neither was nor will be the future. It wasn't in the past, and it won't be in the future. The same thing we say about every other economic system. So it has very profound applicability, this concept, to understanding the conditions for change right now.
A couple things come to mind again. One is, sometimes people talk about the emperor's new clothes, but that isn't really what we're talking about here, because in the emperor's new clothes, everybody knew the emperor was naked, but had their reasons for not admitting it. We're really talking about learning to see things for what they are. We're talking about coming from a state of thinking the emperor has clothes on to realizing he doesn't, right? And instinctively, I guess, some of us are drawn to this. I remember watching some documentary 30 years ago about North Korea, and showing all the regimentation and the things that seem crazy, and we love our chairman and all this. And, thinking, well, in what way do we look insane? Right? I mean, what do we do as a matter of course? And I'm not saying they do that as a matter of course. This is a politically motivated documentary, but what is it we do that future generations will think is insane or immoral? And that's what, to me, that's what you're talking about. So when you mentioned, for example, slavery and how assumed it was to be a part of the world until recently, and I've thought about that in terms of, I was vegan for a couple of years. I couldn't stick with it, but one of my motivations was, now I'll get comments about how it was morally wrong not to stick with it. But one of my thinkings was, what if when I look at it through the eyes of the future, the way we look at slaveholders now, what if generations from now, people who eat meat will be looked at in the same way? I certainly think animals are conscious beings, so maybe maybe I'm committing a sin in the eyes of the future, or an immoral act. Sin is, theological, but an immoral act in the eyes of the future. It seems to me that's one way to, I mean, it's a little bit self-punitive, but isn't that one way to start thinking about this stuff?
Yeah, and I think the minute you start, I think it'll have a momentum. You will add, wherever you start, you will then be on the road to asking these questions. But to respond directly to what you ask, here's two more examples. Already the rest of the world looks at the United States as if we are insane. For example, much of my family is European, French and German. I get emails every week, once or twice, in which my relatives tell me and remind me that in the back of their house, there's a little cabin which I can come to with my wife and children. And I say to them, it's very kind of you to offer, but why are you doing that? I mean, I don't know anymore, but they explain to me, because everybody shoots everybody in your country. Because for them, this weekly rendition of who shot who in what church or parking lot or supermarket or school is an unthinkable lunacy that they do not understand, that everybody's loaded up with guns, that human beings actually think having 3 rifles in the trunk of your car really makes you safer than having only 2 or maybe none at all. For that lunacy. Here's another one. The biggest single killer of people in the United States year in and year out is the private automobile. The single worst cause of air pollution that kills millions is the single private automobile. The biggest user of fossil fuel is the private automobile is a killing machine. The only rational way to move the majority of people, who, by the way, live in urban and suburban areas, is to link those two to a mass public, clean, well-kept mass transit system. It is obviously the best way to go. We don't do it. We are now celebrating, by making him the richest man on earth, Elon Musk, who, instead of telling us how we can get a mass transportation system, has worked out a way to not do that and to keep hold of the private car, but simply shift it from fossil fuel to electricity. I mean, this is stupidity made worse by saying, for this failed solution, we're going to make you the richest man on the planet. This is a society that is gone and will be viewed with disbelief in exactly the way you just asked about. And I could give you 1,000 other examples. I mean, it's stunning. The President of the United States announced a few weeks ago how proud he was that in his deal with the Republicans, we are going to have level social spending in this year and next year. We will not have a cut. I'm an economist. If you have the same amount of money this year and next, and our inflation rate is 5% with at least a 50-50 chance of getting worse, you are agreeing to a minimum of a 10% cut in the real services you can deliver to your people. That is a staggering program of austerity. And by calling it a wonderful achievement of level funding, you don't change what the reality is, but you pretend otherwise. And the world will look back on that with the same disbelief. Is this possible that we're actually going to see that? And I think that the reification is wrapped up in these frozen notions of fixity that people feel are a refuge, a safe place, and they're not. They are a terrible, destructive impact on you. And so the saddest thing of all is that you're holding on to something for safety that is exactly the opposite, an enormous danger to you.
And I'll just go you one better on both of those points, Richard Wolff, which, if I may, I'm not trying to
Please.
top you, I'm learning from you, but one is, not only does Elon Musk promote the automobile, but his concept of mass transit is this ludicrous idea of tunnels underneath cities to carry individual cars on trains, which cities like Los Angeles are giving him money to look into, that will one day be looked at but as buffoonery of Charlie Chaplin level, but in real life it's ludicrous. That's number one. But number two, far more serious, the austerity cuts that you just described to social spending are taking place in a country where one in 6 children lives in poverty, if my recollection is correct. We're approaching 40 million or so people of all ages live in poverty, where many more people live on the brink of poverty or have food insecurity. And yet the solution is, oh, we're only going to cut by 10%. Isn't that great? Yes. So, yeah, so the eyes you're talking about are the eyes we need to have. Now, Richard Wolff, the side of reification we didn't get to talk about, or the related topic, maybe it'll be for next time, that Lukács and I think some others have, I believe, have explored, is this whole idea of commodity fetishism, consumer fetishism, how in this vacuum created by this reified thinking, we are programmed to kind of replace the gap with, a boat or something. But I have a feeling we're out of time, so maybe that'll be our next topic. But any closing thoughts before I let you go?
No, I think yes, it's a deep topic, and I know there's a hesitance in social media to get too far into the deep topic. But deep is part of the water. You wouldn't have the water up if you didn't have the deep is part of the story. And from time to time, to get into that, I learned enormously reading Lukács. It was one of the great moments of my life. He opened up for me the question, wow, what is the common sense today? Where is it going? How can the things I say and do shift and change the common sense now that I understand it's variable, now that I am not lost in a world where it's fixed and there's nothing I can do? It's a part of making you more alive, more engaged, more part of the process of change, rather than being lost in the spectator position where you are light years from participating. Very depressing to people to feel left out of the process of change. And I think, therefore, to understand reification, yeah, it's a deep concept, but it can change your life in the ways that matter to you on a very personal level.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is not optional. I think this is the vital work of social change. I really do. So I thank you so much for that. And maybe we can also get into, I had a transformative moment when I read Paulo Freire and Pedagogy of the Oppressed and Internalizing the Oppressor Consciousness, even though he was talking about, the peasant class, we all do that too. So all of these ideas to me, which you are so good at explaining, to me, this is not tangential to the work. This is the work, and the rest of the activism flows from it. So as always, Richard Wolff, I thank you for your insights and your time, and thank you so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure, RJ, and it makes me very eager to continue the conversation soon.
As I certainly hope we will. And we'll be back very soon right after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.